Two New Yorkers, two microphones, and one man who could never take a joke. Before the rallies, before the endless press conferences, before fake news became a daily headline, there was Rosie O'Donnell and Donald Trump. What started as a throwaway comment on daytime TV turned into a 2-decade-long feud that revealed more about Trump's character than any campaign speech ever could. It all began back in 2006 on The View. Rosie O'Donnell was at the height of her talk show fame, outspoken, fearless, and unapologetically herself. During a discussion about Trump's decision to forgive a scandal-plagued beauty pageant contestant, Rosie did what she's always done best. She told the truth the way New Yorkers do, straight, sharp, and with a smirk. She called Trump a snake oil salesman, a man who had built his reputation on smoke, mirrors, and gold paint. Her words cut through the television static like electricity. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't scripted. It was one of those moments that felt too real for TV, and America noticed. Trump noticed too. And for a man who prides himself on always getting the last word, Rosie's jab felt like a wound that never healed. Within hours, Trump fired back the only way he knew how, through personal attacks. He mocked her appearance, her career, and her private life. He called her names that made headlines for weeks. He threatened to sue her. He told reporters he wanted to take money out of her pockets. But Rosie didn't blink. She didn't apologize, and she didn't disappear. Instead, she laughed. She turned his rage into material, mocking his bankruptcies, his failed ventures, and his obsession with being liked. To the public, it looked like a celebrity spat. But in hindsight, it was something bigger. The first glimpse of Trump's most fragile weakness. He could handle anything but being laughed at. For years, their back and forth would flare up and fade away, resurfacing any time one of them grabbed a microphone. Rosie didn't just insult Trump, she exposed him. She saw through the branding, the self-promotion, the illusion of power. And she called it what it was, performance. At the time, most people laughed it off as Hollywood drama. But a decade later, when Trump stepped into the White House, those old clips resurfaced like ghosts of warning. The world was now seeing, on the biggest stage, the same man Rosie had described years earlier. A thin-skinned showman who treated every critic like an enemy and every spotlight like a throne. And that's when another voice joined the story, one with a sharper pen and a bigger platform. Stephen Colbert. Colbert had built his reputation as a master of satire. He didn't just tell jokes, he dissected power, wrapped it in irony, and handed it back to the audience like evidence. But when Trump became president, Colbert's comedy shifted. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a nightly reality check for a country trying to make sense of chaos. While Trump used Twitter to attack his critics, Colbert used live television to turn those same moments into punchlines that doubled as truth bombs. Each joke had precision. Each line had purpose. And behind every laugh, there was something deeper. Accountability disguised as comedy. Rosie and Colbert never officially teamed up, but together they represented two sides of the same resistance. Rosie was raw, emotional, unfiltered, the voice of frustration and outrage. Colbert was strategic, polished, surgical, the voice of satire and reason. Where Rosie threw the first punch, Colbert turned it into an art form. And between them, they did what few could. They turned Trump's insults, lies, and tantrums into national punchlines that stuck. The brilliance of their approach was that they didn't argue. They didn't debate. They joked. Because laughter has a power that anger never could. When people laugh at you, the fear disappears. The control slips away. And for a man built on control, that's unbearable. By the time Trump entered the Oval Office, late-night television had become a cultural battleground. Every monologue, every tweet, every viral clip felt like a tug of war between truth and performance. And right there in the middle of it were the two people who had been calling him out long before it was politically fashionable, Rosie O'Donnell and Stephen Colbert. Their words hit harder than most news reports because they were honest. No filters, no teleprompters, just voices saying what millions at home were thinking. They made the absurd make sense. They made the powerful look small. And most importantly, they reminded everyone watching that laughter isn't just entertainment, it's rebellion. The feud that began as gossip on a talk show had grown into something symbolic. It was no longer about insults or celebrity drama. It was about truth versus vanity, about who gets to control the story and who gets to laugh at it. By the time 2017 arrived, one thing had become crystal clear. Rosie O'Donnell might have started the fight, but Stephen Colbert made sure it never faded. Together, they turned mockery into a mirror, one that Trump couldn't bear to look into because it showed him exactly who he was. And for a man who lived for applause, the sound of laughter, especially when it wasn't for him, became his greatest nightmare. By the time Donald Trump settled into the White House, the cameras were already rolling, and so were the jokes. But these weren't just late-night laughs anymore. They were lifelines for millions of people trying to make sense of a political storm that felt both unreal and unavoidable. Enter Stephen Colbert. For years, Colbert had been the calm storm of satire, the man who could slice through hypocrisy with a single raised eyebrow. But under Trump, something changed. The laughs were still there, but the purpose behind them grew heavier. Colbert's monologues turned into nightly therapy sessions, part comedy, part civic intervention. He wasn't shouting into the void, he was talking to the people. And his message was simple: you're not crazy for noticing what's wrong. When Trump stood beside Vladimir Putin and dismissed U.S. intelligence reports, Colbert didn't scream, he didn't rant. He leaned into the desk, smiled at the camera, and did the math out loud. Egotism plus denial plus naivety equals unfit for office. The audience laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. That's the genius of Colbert. He makes truth bearable by wrapping it in humor. His comedy became a scalpel, dissecting power while pretending to just tell jokes. And across the country, people tuned in, not just for entertainment, but for validation. Every punchline said what they wished someone in Washington would dare to say. Every laugh reminded them that they weren't alone. At the same time, Rosie O'Donnell was still out there, still fierce, still unfiltered, and still refusing to stay quiet. She had long stopped trying to win Trump's approval. Now she was fighting for something bigger: accountability. While Colbert sat behind a polished desk, Rosie was on the streets with a microphone in her hand. She joined protests outside the White House, leading chants, holding signs, speaking from the gut. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her words cut like truth serum. "We the people will get him out," she said, to a soaked crowd under a gray Washington sky. They weren't polished, they weren't rehearsed, they were raw, and they hit harder than any press conference could. Rosie had been one of the first to see through Trump's act, and she had paid for it with years of public abuse. But she kept going, because for her, the feud was never just personal, it was moral. Trump, meanwhile, did what Trump always did. He tweeted, he lashed out, he tried to turn ridicule into rage, hoping to drown out the laughter that haunted him every night on television. He called Rosie names, he mocked Colbert's ratings. He tried to frame the comedians as enemies of the people, as if a punchline was somehow a national threat. But the more he reacted, the louder the laughter got. Because nothing proves a joke is true quite like watching its target lose control. Colbert once said that comedy doesn't create outrage, it reveals it. And in Trump's America, there was plenty to reveal. When the country was anxious, Colbert gave them clarity. When the news was overwhelming, he gave them a reason to smile again, not because things were okay, but because they needed the strength to face another day. The key to Colbert's success wasn't just his wit, it was his restraint. He didn't need to shout. He let the absurdity speak for itself. One perfectly timed pause, one smirk, one raised eyebrow, and the message landed louder than 1,000 angry headlines. He'd start with a simple sentence that felt like a statistic, then step back and let the audience laugh, cheer, or groan, turning that moment of shared emotion into something powerful. That's not just comedy, that's connection. Meanwhile, Rosie used her platform in her own way, through raw honesty and brutal truth. She didn't polish her delivery, she didn't soften her tone. She spoke like someone who had seen too much to stay polite. She called Trump mentally unstable, unfit for office, a danger to democracy. And she said it not as an entertainer, but as a citizen who'd had enough. Her words weren't elegant, but they were electric. They carried emotion the way thunder carries light. And people listened. Because in a time when truth was constantly twisted, Rosie didn't mince hers. She turned frustration into fire. And that fire spread across social media, through rallies, into living rooms where people finally felt heard. Colbert and Rosie were different kinds of warriors. One wielded a joke, the other wielded a megaphone, but their mission was the same. They reminded people that democracy needs voices willing to laugh in the face of intimidation. That free speech doesn't survive on politeness, it survives on courage. And together they exposed Trump's greatest weakness, his inability to let anything go. Every time Rosie mocked him, he responded. Every time Colbert roasted him, he reacted. Every time someone laughed, he seethed. That's the thing about humor. It disarms power because it doesn't play by power's rules. You can argue with a critic, you can attack a journalist, but you can't silence a laugh that's already echoing through millions of homes. Trump could tweet all night, he could threaten lawsuits, he could rage on television, but he could never win a fight against laughter. By 2017, the feud that began on a talk show couch had become something much bigger. It was no longer about two entertainers, it was about what they represented. Colbert stood for intelligence and irony, the power of thinking clearly in a fog of noise. Rosie stood for defiance and honesty, the refusal to be intimidated by cruelty. Together, they embodied something America was starting to rediscover, that laughter, when used right, is a weapon. Not one that wounds, but one that wakes people up. So while Trump held rallies filled with cheers, Rosie and Colbert held audiences filled with laughter. And in the end, both kinds of noise mattered. But only one of them came from truth. By 2017, the rivalry between Donald Trump and America's comedians wasn't just entertainment anymore. It had become a mirror, one that reflected everything people loved, hated, and feared about power. At the center of that mirror stood two familiar faces, Rosie O'Donnell and Stephen Colbert. Two voices from opposite corners of television, united by one simple truth. They had both seen through Trump long before the rest of the world did. That year, Colbert and another host pulled off something rare, a live crossover event that felt less like a comedy stunt and more like a declaration. Split screens, two stages, one mission, expose the absurdity of a president who couldn't take a joke. Colbert's tone that night was sharp but playful. He wasn't angry, he was deliberate. Every line landed like a reminder that laughter is democracy's last line of defense. And somewhere in the White House, Trump was watching, fuming, tweeting, unable to ignore the echo of his own mockery bouncing off studio walls. Rosie, on the other hand, stayed in the field, the streets, the rallies, the protests. Her words didn't come from teleprompters or cue cards, they came from the gut. She talked about the danger of apathy, the cost of silence, and the madness of watching the most powerful man in the world unravel in real time. When she spoke, she didn't sound like a celebrity, she sounded like the public's conscience. She reminded people that before Trump was president, he was a reality show host who made a career out of firing others. Now, millions were ready to return the favor, not with hatred, but with accountability. Colbert understood that too. His comedy wasn't just about getting laughs, it was about exposing the fragility behind the power. Every night, he'd turn complex scandals into simple truths. Every monologue became a kind of national group therapy, part truth-telling, part collective release. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to insult. He simply held up the facts and let the audience connect the dots, because the absurdity spoke for itself. When Trump called dictators friends, Colbert smiled and said, "Well, it's nice to see him finally meet someone he won't fire." The crowd erupted. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity wrapped in humor. And that was what made Trump furious. The more Colbert joked, the more Trump tweeted. The more Rosie spoke, the more he lashed out. The louder the laughter got, the thinner his patience wore. Because that's the thing about comedy. It doesn't just expose the truth, it makes the powerful realize how small they look when everyone's laughing. Rosie once joked that Trump was the Burger King of politics, obsessed with fast food and faster praise. It wasn't just a punchline, it was a metaphor. He wanted the crown, but he never understood that in comedy, the crown belongs to whoever tells the truth. And that night, Rosie and Colbert both wore it effortlessly. When Colbert performed live after Trump's State of the Union speech, he turned what was supposed to be a solemn address into a masterclass on political satire. While pundits debated what the president really meant, Colbert told the audience exactly what everyone was thinking. He made people laugh, but he also made them listen. That's what made his monologues dangerous. They didn't just entertain, they educated. Meanwhile, Rosie used her platform to speak about issues beyond herself. Children separated from parents, women's rights, the erosion of truth. She said what others were too afraid to. This isn't politics anymore, it's survival. Her anger came from love for country, for justice, for the people who felt unheard. And her words carried weight because they weren't rehearsed, they were real. Trump's reaction was predictable. He mocked her again, called her names again, even joked about suing her again, as if repeating the same insults could erase the damage of her words. But what he didn't understand was that every insult only proved her point. Every tantrum confirmed the truth she'd been shouting for years, that he could not stand strong women who refused to bow. Colbert once described comedy as truth wearing a funny hat, and by now that hat fit perfectly. Through wit and timing, he showed America what power looks like when it's afraid of laughter. He didn't have to attack, he just had to hold up a mirror. And what the world saw in that reflection wasn't strength, it was insecurity. Together, Colbert and Rosie turned ridicule into resistance. They gave people permission to question what they were told, to see the spectacle for what it really was, performance without purpose. In doing so, they reminded everyone that satire isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Because when politicians fear jokes more than questions, you know the jokes are doing their job. Even years later, clips of Colbert's monologues and Rosie's fiery speeches still circulate online, proof that live truth, once spoken, never really dies. You can edit footage, you can delete tweets, but you can't erase laughter that came from honesty. That's the power Trump never understood. You can't win against humor because humor doesn't fight you, it exposes you. And once the audience sees the truth, the performance is over. For all the chaos and controversy, for all the insults and late-night reactions, one thing became undeniable. Trump's greatest opponents were never politicians. They were the comedians who refused to play by his rules. Rosie O'Donnell and Stephen Colbert didn't just roast him, they revealed him. They peeled away the showmanship, the slogans, and the spectacle until all that was left was the man underneath, defensive, fragile, desperate for applause. And that's the irony of it all. The man who built an empire on being untouchable was undone by laughter. Not a scandal, not a headline, not a rival politician, just laughter. Because once the audience starts laughing at you instead of with you, the illusion of control shatters. And for a man who once measured his worth in applause, that silence between laughs was the loudest sound of all. Two entertainers, two microphones, one fragile ego that could never handle the truth. Rosie O'Donnell lit the fuse, Stephen Colbert kept it burning, and together they reminded America of something timeless. That in the face of arrogance and lies, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is laugh.